So what has been interesting about reading this source and a lot of the other sources, as I mentioned, is that you get a sense of none of this being predetermined, and that every day the story can change radically.
Thank you, Judy. Well, Jeff promised you a constitutional conversation, so we'd like to speak for a few minutes on stage, but then we want to get to your very good questions. I've read through them already. If I can just quickly ask the audience, how many of you have seen the Disunion blog online? That's pretty good sampling. How many of you read the New York Times online every day? And how many of you read the Times online and the print paper? Both. I'm still in that in-between zone.
Old people.
And how about just the print version? Okay, because these were fundamental questions for us as we were planning the blog. And does the fact that we are writing online change the way in which we are writing? And I think it did in subtle ways, but we can maybe get into that in conversation. Well, as Jeff said, we are at the NCC, and therefore I think we should look for a moment at the constitutional ramifications of the Civil War. And throughout the war, of course, the Constitution is being tested and bent and violated and studied with great care, including by the President of the United States, who in many ways rises to national prominence with his Cooper Union speech, which is a very close examination of the question of what the founders thought about this vexing question of slavery. And we have a question from Jim of Mays Landing, New Jersey. It goes right to the heart of a question Lincoln was thinking a lot about in 1860 and 61. A constitutional issue that is rarely discussed is the right of states to secede. Did South Carolina and the other states act within their rights or violate the Constitution? Sean, can you take a whack at that one?
They violated the Constitution. But hold on, I'll explain why I said that. The question of secession, Ted, goes back well before 1861. New Englanders were talking about seceding as early as 1803, 1804, because they didn't like these Jeffersonians and these slaveholders and these Jacobins, as they called them. That didn't get very far, but still they were talking about it. In 1832-33, John C. Calhoun raised the issue of nullification, or rather the state of South Carolina did, over the tariff, which has misled a lot of people thinking the Civil War was about the tariff, which it was not. You didn't see too many people just dying to say, I want a low tariff, and willing to die for it. No, it didn't happen.
The Tea Party would.
You know, I'm not even sure they would have gone that far. So the question of secession, though, President Andrew Jackson, when he crushed the nullification movement in 1832-33, made a proclamation, delivered a proclamation, which really squelched the idea of secessionists having any constitutional standing whatsoever. The idea that of state sovereignty, that the Constitution of the United States, the nation that is formed with the Constitution of the United States, is simply a group of states put together, you know, and they can come in or out as they want to. He said the government of the United States is a government, not a league, a government. So when the South Carolinians finally went ahead and, you know, seceded in 1861 on the basis of a perfectly democratic and constitutional election, by the way, and what they were objecting to was the election of Abraham Lincoln, right? Lincoln turned to Jackson, among others, to declare secession the essence of anarchy, he called it. And it really goes to the heart of what the Constitution was all about and what the Union was all about. And the Union actually precedes the Constitution, for one thing. But there is a nation and there are states. And the Constitution is about the nation, and you cannot secede from the nation. The nation exists. That was later, you know, don't talk about secession now because the Supreme Court case took care of all that in Texas v. White. So it's not even a problem. But in 1860-61, look, the Confederates didn't think that they were violating the Constitution, but then again, they were making war against the country whose Constitution they had been under. So it's kind of hard to say that they think of secession as a constitutional action.
Adam, do you
Yeah,
want
if I
to
could chime in. It's interesting that literally as the dead and wounded were lying on the field at Gettysburg, America was celebrating the 4th of July, was celebrating Independence Day the day after the fighting ended. And when I say America, it wasn't just the North. Surprisingly, Southerners were also, if you look in the newspapers, firing off fireworks and salutes and ringing bells for the holiday, because throughout the Civil War, although less and less, I think, as the war went on, both sides claimed that legacy of the Founding Fathers. And in fact, when I was looking through those newspapers, I found a quotation that I think cuts to the heart of this question from a Georgia newspaper on that July 4th, 1863. They didn't yet know about the news at Gettysburg. But this editor wrote, "Our ancestors fought for self-government," by which he meant the revolutionaries. "We fight for the same sacred right." And that's something that you even hear today from some neo-Confederates making that argument for the legal right of secession. But I think it's important to say what was different about 1776 and 1861. And that is, of course, in 1776, those men who met and represented their colonies just down the block from here at Independence Hall, they were part of no voluntary political compact, no constitutional compact with the mother country of England. They weren't part of the English parliamentary system. In fact, their entire grievance was that this was a case of taxation and legislation without representation. So they really weren't seceding from anything. They were rebelling against an empire. There was no compact for them to rebel against. Whereas in 1861, of course, as Sean Wilentz just pointed out, there was a compact that they had been part of since the at least 1780s.
You know, with this blog, we really wanted to try to tell the story in some new ways, and just about everyone loves Abraham Lincoln. He's the most beloved figure in our history, and if he wasn't before 2012, he certainly is now after Daniel Day-Lewis. But there is a kind of tyranny, and I'm not a neo-Confederate, but there's a kind of tyranny to the story. He just looks so good. His speeches are so beautiful. Lincoln is at the center of the story from beginning to end. And one of the great Lincoln speeches was given around the corner as he was coming in to become president in February 1861. He gave a great speech at Independence Hall, sort of outlining why we had to get ready for this conflict. But we remained a constitutional society throughout the war, and the Supreme Court is functioning and making decisions, and Congress is functioning. And what do you think about the performance of the U.S. government as an integrated whole throughout the conflict? Sean, you did a piece on
The U.S.
Congress.
government, yeah. Well, first of all, there are neighborhoods in Charleston, South Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, Jackson, Mississippi, in which Abraham Lincoln is not the most famous. Well, I mean, one of the remarkable things about the Confederates try to construct a government. They don't do a terribly good job, but it kind of gets through. The American government, the Union government, the United States government, the government of the United States, continues, as you said. They have elections. They have political parties. Everything happens in a political order that you might think was under tremendous stress. But I think the question that you're getting at, Ted, is that so much attention is put on Lincoln and his generals that we forget about everything else. And there were important Supreme Court decisions being made, not all of them terribly great at this point. But the Congress is really important. Remember, the Congress in 1861, was a very different thing than it had been ever before because the entire South had left. Well, not quite the entire South, but most of the South, certainly the Deep South. So you had basically, Congress of the United States was a northern Congress who can do pretty much what it wanted to do because the Republicans, they didn't have a majority, but they had close enough one to get a lot of stuff done. So they did, and they also pushed the issue of emancipation. We don't think about Congress's involvement in emancipation, but independent of Lincoln, and sometimes working hand in glove, I think, quietly. Congress does a lot to press forward the question of emancipation from the contraband slaves onward. So I think that you have to, in assessing both governments, but especially the United States, you have to look at all of these institutions and see them as working both in concert and sometimes divided against each other, producing what was eventually going to be the end of slavery and the Union victory.
If I can jump topics now, I've got a question from Scott of Voorhees, New Jersey, which, Judy, if I can throw your way. How was the media handling the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863 and the months preceding the Battle of Gettysburg? So how were people of Pennsylvania or around the country getting the news of the emancipation?
Well, Pennsylvanians were very divided about the proclamation. There were very active and almost seditious Democratic newspapers operating out of Harrisburg and a couple of other places in Pennsylvania. And a couple of newspaper editors were actually arrested. And it was probably the best thing for their careers because they made such a big deal that I think they were in jail for a couple of days, and they kept talking about it forever afterward. But there was great difference of opinion in Pennsylvania, in the newspapers about emancipation, among citizens of Pennsylvania. In the aftermath, of course, after the Emancipation Proclamation, Black Philadelphians, Black Pennsylvanians celebrate in their churches. But in the weeks after the Emancipation Proclamation is passed, petitions come from throughout the state of Pennsylvania to Harrisburg, petitioning the state of Pennsylvania to pass a black code, which would have prohibited black migration into the state of Pennsylvania. And it starts ironically or oddly from like the northernmost reaches of Pennsylvania, Clearfield County, some of those counties as far north in Pennsylvania as you can possibly go, start to petition Harrisburg to say, if this Emancipation Proclamation is going to be a real thing, then we need a law in Pennsylvania to stop blacks from coming into the state. And this is coming from someplace that's probably never seen a person of color that far north in Pennsylvania, or very few. But then that starts in February. By March, April, that becomes, those petitions come from throughout the state. People are worried in Pennsylvania. Whites are worried in Pennsylvania about what emancipation is going to look like. And the House in Harrisburg passes a black code. It never passes the Senate. It never goes anywhere, but the House passes it, saying that, attempting to put in a legal infrastructure to prevent black migration into the state. And some of these petitions actually asked, of course, for what's the next thing you're going to worry about blacks moving in your neighborhood. The second thing you're going to worry about is they're going to marry your daughter. So these petitions suggested that the state also pass a law against interracial marriage. And of course, again, these things, they don't go anywhere, but it gives you some sense of what some Pennsylvanians were worried about after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued.
A person who didn't sign the card asked a very interesting question. What was the immediate reaction to the victory at Gettysburg in the North and the South? Was it viewed as the seminal event we consider it today? Has anyone read in 1863 past the battle enough to...
No,
we stopped on July 3rd.
I can talk about that a little bit, I guess. I think there was a sort of a combination, a culmination of different things that were happening at that moment that did change the course of the war. And of course, the other thing that happened that sort of twinned with the victory at Gettysburg is the victory at Vicksburg that happened the very next day on July 4th. And I think when you look back at the news coverage, you actually see Vicksburg sort of getting equal play with Gettysburg. But one thing that's really interesting to me is what's happened to the memory of Gettysburg since 1863, because I think it is a battle that the popular culture has embraced and the national imagination has embraced in a way that perhaps during the Civil War itself, except for one very notable exception, Abraham Lincoln, people didn't see the full sort of metaphorical potential of this battle at the time. Gettysburg, for a number of reasons, I think has become prominent. And one is that it's a sort of, at least in retrospect, a feel-good moment, or potentially a feel-good moment, for both the Union and the Confederacy. And this is reflected, I think, in the way that many of us were taught the Battle of Gettysburg in high school. We're taught that it was both the moment when the North was saved from the Southern invasion, and that it was the so-called high water mark of the Confederacy, this glorious last hurrah, General Pickett's troops charging up the hill into, if not victory, at least immortality.
Not so immortal.
That's kind of immortality. Right. But it's something that becomes important after the war as the North and South attempt, especially white Northerners and white Southerners at least, try to bind up these old wounds and divisions and find these feel-good moments from the war. Of course, Gettysburg is also an important place because it almost immediately becomes a tourist spot, especially for Northerners. Unlike the other Civil War battlefields that were in Confederate territory and often very inaccessible, Gettysburg is right there in the north. It's on rail lines. So almost immediately people are going there, picking up souvenirs from the battlefield, building monuments, of course, that incredible sort of forest of granite and marble you see out there today. So I think as important and as interesting as what happens immediately after the battle is what happens since. Of course, there's one very sort of tragically ironic moment in 1913, the 50th anniversary of the battle, when African American Civil War veterans are banned from attending the commemoration and the reunion to which both white Unionists and white Confederate veterans are invited. So a symbol of how African Americans were written out of so much Civil War history.
Can I add one thing about Gettysburg?
Yes.
Photography. Battle of Antietam, and then Gettysburg. Matthew Brady, Alexander Gardner, Timothy O'Sullivan, they begin to photograph the battlefields. And they bring them back, and they go to Brady's gallery and then Gardner's gallery in Washington, D.C., and they display them. And Americans can see the horror of war as they've never seen it before. And that has a tremendous impact on people's understanding of the war at the time and our own understanding of the war. I mean, how many of us remember that the photograph from Gettysburg called Harvest of Death? And you've all seen it, and it's part of our imaginary about the Civil War. But that was a very new, talk about new media, a new technique that was coming into play, and the Civil War did more to introduce Americans to photography than anything else.
There are two, not one, but two amazing shows in New York at the moment, a show on Civil War photography at the Met, and literally around the corner within the Met, the art, the painting of the Civil War. So if you are in Manhattan this summer, I commend those two shows. We have a wonderfully terse question, probably from a Twitter addict. In fact, considerably short of 140 characters. The question is, Copperheads, question mark? And let me embellish it by, you heard the word Valendine. We had a spirited conversation before the panel about how to pronounce that word. And then we realized we're the only 4 people who cared how you pronounce it. But Sean, can you tell us briefly the story of Clement, what's his name?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the story of Copperhead. There's a great deal of restiveness in the North about slavery, about secession, about the Union cause, mostly Democrats. Vallandigham was an Ohio man who was particularly vicious and made a reputation for this. And he gave that speech that I mentioned. And he does get arrested and does, in fact, get imprisoned supposedly for the duration of the war. Lincoln is wise enough to see that they're making a martyr out of him. And he changes the sentence. He's basically expelled. And then he comes around, actually, comes back out to Canada, and he runs for governor from Canada. He got the Democratic nomination. It tells you something about the Democratic Party in those days. And he could have won, except then the Union Army started doing better, so he lost. But Copperhead, there's a new movie coming out called Copperhead, which may be I have not seen this movie. No one has seen this movie. I can already say it may be the worst film ever made about the Civil War.
Do you think, speaking of movies, was Abraham Lincoln a vampire hunter?
Yeah, right. Hey, look, I'll speak personally. Any movie that makes the slaveholding South and a bunch of ghouls can't be all bad.
Here's back to Gettysburg. Bob Bond of Wynwood, Pennsylvania asks, what was Lee's ultimate objective in this invasion of the North? Do we know? Was he trying to circle back and take Washington? Judy?
Well, he certainly wanted to take some pressure off of Virginia. He wanted to, he wanted to take some pressure off the Southern civilians. I mean, that's certainly part of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, you see also a lot of talk among the Southern generals and among the Southern public of let's make them feel the sting of war in the North the way that we're feeling it in the South.
Right.
And I think there was that feeling of once they actually suffer up there, it doesn't really, I think the military objectives, the strategic objectives didn't matter so much because they knew they couldn't really hold Philadelphia, they couldn't hold Harrisburg, they might not have even been able to hold Washington, but they knew that if they could make some pain felt, that might accomplish some important propaganda
And
objectives.
maybe
Were
turn
they
an election.
And maybe
inflicting-
turn an election.
inflicting pain on the civilian population in the way that they later criticized William Sherman for the same thing in the South?
Well, not that.
No.
Well, it wasn't quite March to the Sea. But they
They did talk about burning cities, and I mean, they did say if we could burn Harrisburg or we could burn Philadelphia. They talked about that earlier.
And they went to a couple of Pennsylvania towns, and they actually threatened
did.
to burn them if they didn't turn over the African Americans they were hiding. I mean, it's shades of the Nazis in Eastern
Very much
Europe.
so.
And imagine if the South had managed to hold out until the middle of July, and then that city 150 miles north of here explodes. Then you have a major
That's
problem
right.
on your
Yeah.
hands if you were Abraham Lincoln, because the draft riots break out in New York. Indeed, the draft riots were quelled by sending troops from Gettysburg to New York to try and put them down because the local militia couldn't handle it. But imagine if that hadn't gone that way. And imagine if that explosion occurred in the great northern metropolis, and the South happens to be, Robert E. Lee is still in Pennsylvania. Then the pressure, which I really think what Lee was really trying to do, was to break northern morale. To feed off their crops for once, to make them, take pressure off the South in many ways, but also just to break northern morale. That was what the South had to do. As Ted said, it wasn't about conquering, it wasn't about winning the war, right? It was about breaking northern morale. And you have to think that they could have come quite close. They could have come quite close.
This is related. It's from Alex Foxwell of Chestertown, Maryland, where Adam and I have both lived. What were the economic ramifications of the invasion of Pennsylvania, and how did that affect living conditions? Judy, you may be closest to this with your study of Emily.
Well, certainly for those Pennsylvanians who stood in the direct sort of line that Lee's army, sort of in the way of Lee's army, this would have incredible, many years effect on those communities. Gettysburg, residents of Gettysburg were cleaning up, were desperately trying to clean up as Lincoln's train was coming in November to give the speech to sort of, remove the last coffins that had not yet been reinterred at the National Cemetery, and, to redig wells, to get roads working again. So for Adams County, Gettysburg residents, this was going to be a really long recovery. Chambersburg is another one of those towns. Chambersburg gets burned 3 times during the war, if I count them right. Is that right? Yeah, I think 3 times. And they will harbor deep frustrations with the Lincoln administration for selling them out, sort of leaving them as sort of a breaking point for the Confederate Army once they got burned for the 3rd time. So, I mean, a town like Chambersburg, not a really big town, but the effects of that 3rd burning was, where the people were still rebuilding from the last when they got the last one. What else about? I don't know if there's a lot of other sort of economic ramifications, larger ramifications in Pennsylvania for the invasion. I don't know, other than those people who were sort of directly affected.
Well, there were a lot of interesting things going on in Pennsylvania economically in general during the Civil War. And it's, again, as Sean pointed out, there were lots of interesting things happening in the war that weren't happening on the battlefields and that weren't happening in Lincoln's White House. And one of the things that was going on in Pennsylvania was this enormous oil boom that's happening during the war. It was really sort of the growth of the Rockefeller fortune, the growth of much of the post-war industry. And there's an amazing painting that's in the Smithsonian, I think is part of the show that Ted just mentioned at the Met on loan. And it's a painting of a burning oil well in Pennsylvania. And it was painted in 1861 or 62, I think. And it's basically a pillar of fire shooting into the sky. And you look at it, and it's, of course, several things at once. It's this burning oil well. It's a symbol of this new American industry. And, of course, it's the pillar of fire, perhaps, that was leading the Israelites to freedom. So this new war for freedom that was being fought. So all these things were coming together. And
then there's those after shots of the oil fields and just this sort of incredible environmental degradation that occurs in those communities, and you'd also sort of add to that not only oil but the lumber industry. There's sort of whole counties in north central Pennsylvania that are deforested during the war.
There were photographs in the photography show of photographers with great pride took pictures of the trestles, of the incredible wooden constructions of bridges to get trains across valleys. And they were incredible in their own right. But then behind them, you look at the hills and they're denuded of trees.
Yeah.
It was like a plague of locusts was also coming along behind the armies and destroying foliage.
You know, it bears mentioning too, far be it from me to ever say anything nice about the Confederates, but there are accounts of the Confederates very scrupulously paying for things that they were taking from these merchants and farmers in Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, they paid with Confederate currency, so you sort of picture these, well, and what do I do with this?
Yeah, there's actually in your newspaper, somebody says that in one of the newspaper accounts. They said the Confederates are showing up, but they're paying for things in Confederate script. Like, no.
Well, I just got a sign that was kind of like this, which meant either it's time to do some vampire hunting or we're at the end of our program. But I want to thank you all so much for coming out and these very good questions. And let's all thank Jeff Rosen, the new president and CEO of the National Constitution Center. And please thank my fellow panelists.
See you downstairs.